"You are not getting served on this flight." The sentence echoed through
anything
the
I can get for you
first-class
right
cabin loudly enough
No,
to
would you
turn
care for a
heads from
drink?
3 different
Yes,
rows.
please.
Conversation
go.
stopped.
Thank you.
A businessman
Thank
lowered his
you.
newspaper.
It's flight
A woman
details.
near the window
Yes, everything
removed
is on
one
schedule.
earbud. Even
Good,
a
let's
young
review them
traveler
now.
typing on a laptop paused to
Fine,
look
thank
up.
you.
Standing
Oh,
in
good
the
to hear.
aisle was Rebecca Collins, the
Just a
lead
brief
flight
check-in.
attendant, her
I
posture
understand.
stiff
So we're
and her
expecting a smooth
expression
flight
firm.
today.
Seated beside the
That's
window in
excellent
seat
news.
2A
Thank you so
was
much.
Malcolm Carter. He wore a simple navy sweater, dark jeans, and a modest watch that revealed nothing about his success. There were no visible signs of wealth, no designer labels, no entourage, no clues that would attract attention. Yet somehow he had become the center of it. Rebecca held a beverage tray against her side and looked directly at him. "I have other passengers to attend to," she said. "Please be patient." Malcolm glanced briefly at the empty glass on his tray table. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since boarding began. Every passenger around him had received service. Every passenger except him. "Of course," he replied calmly. The answer seemed to surprise her. Perhaps she expected frustration. Perhaps she expected an argument. Instead, she found herself facing a man who appeared completely unbothered. Rebecca turned and continued down the aisle. The businessman across from Malcolm frowned. He had been watching long enough to notice a pattern. Rebecca had stopped at every row. She had smiled, offered refreshments, asked whether anyone needed assistance. Then she reached Malcolm and moved on. The difference was impossible to miss. Malcolm looked out the window. Airport vehicles moved slowly across the tarmac beneath the afternoon sun. Beyond them, other aircraft prepared for departure. Everything outside appeared normal. Inside the cabin, something felt different. A few rows back, 2 passengers exchanged quiet whispers. "Did she skip him again?" one asked. The other nodded. Third time. Malcolm heard them, but offered no reaction. Years earlier, moments like this would have frustrated him. Years earlier, he might have demanded an explanation. Time and experience had taught him something valuable. People often revealed more about themselves than they realized. Sometimes the smartest thing to do was simply watch. Rebecca returned several minutes later carrying another tray. She stopped beside a passenger across the aisle and offered coffee. Then she assisted another traveler with a meal request. Again she approached Malcolm's row. Again she continued walking. The silence that followed felt louder than any confrontation. A woman seated nearby finally spoke. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I think he ordered before I did." Rebecca forced a smile. "I am aware of my responsibilities." The answer ended the conversation, at least for the moment. Malcolm folded his hands and remained seated. Calm, patient, observing. The aircraft door closed with a soft mechanical sound near the front of the cabin. Departure preparations were beginning. Rebecca glanced back toward Malcolm once more. Something about his composure seemed to bother her. Most passengers became impatient when ignored. Most people wanted recognition. Malcolm appeared completely comfortable without it. Near the galley, a younger flight attendant named Emily Turner watched the interaction unfold. She had noticed it during boarding and continued noticing it now. Something did not feel right. Service delays happened. Mistakes happened. But this did not look like a mistake. It looked intentional. Emily looked toward Malcolm. He sat quietly beside the window, showing no sign of irritation. Then she looked toward Rebecca. The contrast between them could not have been greater. One seemed determined to create distance. The other seemed unwilling to create conflict. As the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate and passengers settled into their seats, nobody in first class realized they were witnessing the opening moments of a story that would soon change the entire flight. The aircraft climbed steadily above the clouds, leaving the city far below. Sunlight poured through the windows of the first-class cabin, casting a warm glow across polished surfaces and quiet conversations. Most passengers had settled into the rhythm of the flight. Laptops opened. Headphones appeared. Business reports filled screens. Yet one subtle tension remained. It hovered around seat 2A. Malcolm Carter sat comfortably by the window, reading a document on his tablet. He looked completely relaxed. There was no sign that he cared about what had happened during boarding or the strange treatment he had received since taking his seat. Across the aisle, however, several passengers continued noticing the same pattern. Rebecca Collins moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She offered beverages to one traveler. She delivered snacks to another. She stopped to answer questions and exchanged friendly smiles with nearly everyone she passed. Then she reached Malcolm's row and continued forward. Again, the businessman across from him finally lowered his newspaper. He had watched enough. "Sir," he said quietly to Malcolm, "are you sure you do not need anything?" Malcolm looked up and smiled politely. "I appreciate the concern. Because she has skipped your row multiple times." Malcolm glanced toward the front galley where Rebecca disappeared behind a curtain. "I noticed." The businessman shook his head. "I would have said something by now." Malcolm returned his attention to the tablet. Sometimes information arrives faster when people are allowed to keep talking. The answer left the businessman puzzled. Yet there was something about Malcolm's calm certainty that made further questions feel unnecessary. A few rows away, Emily Turner continued watching. The more she observed, the less comfortable she became. Flight attendants were trained to treat passengers consistently. Service standards existed for a reason. What she was witnessing no longer looked like oversight. It looked deliberate. Emily stepped into the galley where Rebecca was organizing service carts. "Did Seat 2A receive his meal request?" she asked. Rebecca barely looked up. "I am handling it." Emily hesitated. "I only asked because everyone else in first class has already been served." Rebecca closed a storage compartment with more force than necessary. "Then focus on your responsibilities." The answer ended the conversation, at least temporarily. Emily returned to the cabin. As she walked past Malcolm's seat, she noticed something unexpected. He was not staring at Rebecca. He was not watching the service carts. He was not paying attention to any of it. Instead, he calmly reviewed financial reports on his tablet, as though the entire situation were beneath his concern. That observation stayed with her. Most passengers would have been frustrated by now. Malcolm appeared completely unaffected. Nearly 10 minutes later, Rebecca emerged again with another beverage tray. She stopped beside a passenger 2 rows ahead. Then another. Then another. Once more she approached Malcolm's row. Once more she kept walking. This time the silence felt heavier. Several passengers openly exchanged looks. Nobody missed it anymore. A woman seated nearby finally spoke. "Excuse me," she said. "I think that gentleman has been waiting longer than everyone else." Rebecca forced a thin smile. Some passengers expect privileges they have not earned. The words landed harder than she intended. The cabin grew quiet. Even passengers who had not been paying attention now looked up. Malcolm slowly raised his eyes from the tablet. For the first time since boarding, he looked directly at Rebecca. Yet there was no anger in his expression, no embarrassment, no frustration, just a calm look that somehow made the entire cabin feel smaller. Rebecca turned away and continued walking. Emily stood frozen near the galley entrance. The statement echoed in her mind. Something about it felt wrong, very wrong. And as Malcolm quietly placed his tablet on the tray table and reached for his phone, nobody in first class realized that the flight was about to take a direction none of them expected. Malcolm Carter looked at the phone resting quietly beside his tablet, but made no move to pick it up. Not yet. Around him, the atmosphere inside first class had changed. Earlier, passengers had simply noticed a service inconsistency. Now they were beginning to form opinions. Some believed Rebecca Collins had made an honest mistake. Others were no longer convinced. The comment about privileges lingered in the cabin like turbulence no one could see. A businessman near the aisle closed his newspaper completely. He had lost interest in the headlines. The real story was unfolding a few feet away. Across from him, a woman in a tailored cream blazer leaned closer and lowered her voice. Did she really say that? The businessman nodded. Everyone heard it. Several rows behind them, another passenger glanced toward Malcolm. What stood out was not the treatment he was receiving. It was the way he was handling it. Most people would have complained. Most people would have demanded an explanation. Malcolm simply sat there, calm and composed, as though he were collecting information rather than experiencing an inconvenience. Rebecca emerged from the galley once again carrying fresh beverages. She smiled at passengers. She exchanged pleasantries. She asked whether anyone needed anything else. Yet as she approached row 2, the familiar pattern repeated itself. Her attention shifted elsewhere. The omission was becoming impossible to ignore. Emily Turner stood near the front service area watching everything unfold. The uncomfortable feeling in her stomach continued growing. She replayed the sequence in her mind. Multiple opportunities to provide service. Multiple opportunities to correct the situation. Multiple opportunities to simply treat a passenger the same way everyone else had been treated. Instead, the opposite kept happening. Emily finally approached Rebecca in the galley. "Can I ask something?" Rebecca continued organizing supplies without looking up. "Make it quick." Emily hesitated. "Why is seat 2A still waiting?" Rebecca stopped for a moment before continuing her work. "Because I decide service priorities." Emily frowned. "But first class receives the same service standard." Rebecca closed another compartment. "Not every passenger is the same." The response immediately unsettled Emily. She could not explain why, but something about those words felt worse than everything that came before. Back in the cabin, Malcolm glanced briefly toward the galley entrance. He had not heard the conversation, yet he seemed to sense the growing tension among the crew. His phone vibrated softly on the tray table. A message appeared. He looked at it for only a second before placing the device face down again. Whatever he had read did not surprise him. The woman across the aisle noticed. "You are handling this remarkably well," she said. Malcolm smiled politely. "Getting upset rarely improves the quality of information." The woman laughed softly. "That is an unusual way to look at it." Malcolm nodded. "People reveal themselves when they think there are no consequences." The statement stayed with her. It felt important somehow. Several rows away, another passenger quietly lowered his laptop. He had spent the last 20 minutes observing Rebecca more than working. The pattern was clear. Whether intentional or not, one passenger was being treated differently from everyone else. And everyone could see it. Emily returned to her workstation and opened an internal crew tablet. At first, she intended only to verify meal preferences. Nothing more. Yet curiosity pushed her further. She entered Malcolm Carter's seat number and opened the passenger profile attached to the reservation. A moment later, her eyebrows lifted. Then she looked again. The information displayed on the screen did not match the story she had been watching unfold. Not even close. Certain indicators appeared beside the profile that she had never personally encountered before. Special designations, restricted notes, executive-level markers. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She checked the information a second time, then a third. The results never changed. Slowly, she raised her eyes toward Malcolm. He remained seated by the window, calm as ever, while sunlight reflected across the clouds outside. For the first time since the flight began, Emily realized a possibility she had never considered. The passenger everyone seemed so comfortable dismissing might actually be the most important person on the aircraft. Emily Turner stared at the crew tablet for several more seconds, convinced she had made a mistake. The profile attached to Malcolm Carter's reservation contained markers she had only heard about during training. Certain sections were restricted. Others required higher authorization levels than her own. Yet one thing was immediately clear. This was not an ordinary passenger profile. Emily glanced up from the screen and looked toward seat 2A. Malcolm sat exactly where he had been throughout the flight, calmly watching the clouds drift past the window. Nothing about his appearance suggested special treatment. Nothing about his behavior demanded attention. Yet the information on her screen told a completely different story. Across the cabin, Rebecca Collins continued preparing the next phase of service. Her confidence remained unchanged. As far as she was concerned, everything was under control. Emily closed the tablet and walked toward the galley. She needed clarification. More importantly, she needed to understand why the passenger profile seemed so unusual. "Rebecca," she said quietly. Rebecca looked up from a service card. "What is it now?" Emily hesitated. "I reviewed seat 2A. Rebecca immediately returned to arranging supplies. "And there are executive-level notes attached to the reservation." Rebecca barely reacted. "That happens." Emily frowned. "Not like this." The answer finally earned her attention. Rebecca paused and looked directly at her. "What exactly are you saying?" Emily lowered her voice. "The profile contains restricted designations." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Then stop looking at things that are above your authorization level." The response ended the conversation, but it did not answer the question. Emily stepped back. The more she tried to understand the situation, the stranger it became. Meanwhile, several passengers continued watching events unfold. The businessman across from Malcolm had completely abandoned his newspaper. The woman in the cream blazer occasionally glanced toward the front galley. Everyone sensed the same thing. Something was wrong. The details remained unclear, but the tension had become impossible to ignore. Malcolm remained the only person who appeared completely comfortable. He picked up his tablet again and reviewed several reports. Numbers, charts, corporate summaries. The documents looked important, but nobody nearby could see enough to understand them. A few minutes later, Rebecca emerged from the galley carrying fresh beverages. She moved down the aisle with professional efficiency. Passengers accepted drinks and thanked her. Smiles were exchanged. Conversations resumed. Then she reached Malcolm's row. Once again, she continued walking. This time the silence that followed felt even heavier. The businessman finally shook his head. I have never seen service handled this way. The woman beside him nodded. Neither have I. Malcolm simply smiled faintly. Every situation teaches you something. The businessman looked puzzled. What is this one teaching you? Malcolm glanced briefly toward the front of the cabin. Patience. The answer lingered in the air. Near the galley, Emily reopened the crew tablet. Curiosity pushed her forward once more. She entered additional verification requests. Seconds later, new information appeared. Her eyes widened. One designation stood out immediately. Priority Executive Oversight. Emily had never seen that classification attached to a passenger. Her pulse quickened. She reviewed it again. The designation remained. Then another notification appeared. Corporate Monitoring Enabled. Emily stared at the screen. Corporate monitoring was not activated for ordinary travelers. It was reserved for individuals connected to the highest levels of company operations. Slowly, she looked toward Malcolm again. He remained seated by the window, calm and composed, while afternoon sunlight illuminated the cabin around him. For the first time, Emily began to suspect that the story everyone thought they were watching was only the surface. Beneath it was something far bigger. And as Rebecca continued acting as though Malcolm Carter was the least important passenger on the aircraft, Emily became increasingly convinced that he might actually be the most important person on board. Emily Turner kept staring at the crew tablet long after she should have closed it. Every verification produced the same result. Every restricted marker pointed in the same direction. Yet none of it made sense when compared to the man sitting quietly in seat 2A. Malcolm Carter did not look like someone demanding special treatment. He was not calling for managers. He was not drawing attention to himself. He was simply sitting beside the window, reviewing documents and occasionally gazing at the clouds outside. The contrast between the passenger profile and the man himself made the situation even more confusing. Across the cabin, Rebecca Collins continued her duties as though nothing unusual had happened. She moved from row to row, collecting trays and checking on passengers. Then she reached Malcolm's section. For a brief moment, it appeared she might finally stop. Instead, she looked directly at him and continued walking. Several passengers noticed immediately. A businessman near the aisle shook his head in disbelief. The woman in the cream blazer looked openly frustrated. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was visible to everyone. Emily stepped forward from the galley. "Rebecca," she said quietly. Rebecca stopped. "What?" Emily hesitated. "I really think we should review seat 2A again." Rebecca's expression hardened. "I have already made my decision." Emily lowered her voice further. "The file contains executive oversight indicators." Rebecca folded her arms. "A file does not change what I can see." The words lingered in the air. Emily immediately regretted hearing them, because that sentence explained more than Rebecca intended. Nearby passengers exchanged glances. Malcolm heard the conversation but remained completely calm. He simply closed the document on his tablet and rested his hands on the armrests. Rebecca looked toward him and spoke loudly enough for several rows to hear. "Some passengers expect privileges they have not earned." The cabin fell silent again. This time the silence felt different. Heavier. More uncomfortable. The statement was impossible to ignore. A few passengers lowered their eyes. Others stared directly at Rebecca. Malcolm slowly looked up. For several seconds, neither person spoke. Then Malcolm offered a small smile. Not an angry smile. Not a sarcastic one. Just the smile of someone who had learned long ago that assumptions often reveal more about the speaker than the target. "That is an interesting perspective," he said calmly. Rebecca turned away without responding. Emily stood frozen. She could feel the mood shifting throughout the cabin. People were no longer questioning whether something inappropriate was happening. They were wondering why it continued happening. Malcolm reached for his phone. This time he picked it up. He looked at the screen for a moment before selecting a contact. His expression never changed. There was no urgency, no frustration, no visible emotion at all, just quiet certainty. As the aircraft cruised above the clouds and passengers watched from their seats, Malcolm placed the phone against his ear and waited for the call to connect. Nobody around him knew who he was calling. Nobody understood why the executive indicators attached to his profile existed. But Emily sensed that whatever happened next was about to change the direction of the entire flight. The call connected almost immediately. Malcolm Carter held the phone comfortably against his ear while the first-class cabin remained wrapped in a strange silence. Several passengers pretended not to listen, but every person within a few rows paid attention. Rebecca Collins continued organizing service items near the galley, determined to act as though nothing unusual was happening. Emily Turner watched from a distance, her crew tablet still open to the passenger profile that refused to make sense. Malcolm finally spoke. "Rachel, initiate executive oversight." His voice remained calm and measured. There was no emotion behind the request. No frustration. No urgency. Just certainty. A brief pause followed before a professional voice answered through the speaker. "Understood. Executive oversight protocol is being activated now." Malcolm nodded once. "Thank you." The call ended. That was all. No explanation. No dramatic speech. No visible reaction. Yet within seconds, something began changing. Emily's crew tablet vibrated softly. She looked down. A new notification appeared across the screen. Then another. Then a third. Her eyes widened. Additional access permissions were being activated. Review notices appeared beside Malcolm's reservation. Internal monitoring alerts followed immediately afterward. Emily had never witnessed anything like it. Nearby, another crew member checked a service device and frowned. "Did you just get an operations update?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded. More alerts appeared. Priority review enabled. Executive monitoring active. Corporate authorization verified. Around the cabin, passengers sensed that something significant was unfolding even if they could not see the screens. Rebecca noticed the unusual activity among the crew. "What is going on?" she asked. Nobody answered right away. Emily stared at the tablet. Each notification seemed more important than the last. The passenger profile she had questioned earlier was no longer merely unusual. It was becoming the center of attention across multiple internal systems. Rebecca stepped closer. "Emily." Emily looked up. "Yes." "What is happening?" Emily hesitated. "I am not entirely sure." That answer alone was unsettling. Rebecca folded her arms. "Then why is everyone looking at their devices?" Emily glanced back down at the screen. "Because the system is reacting to something." Across the aisle, the businessman who had been observing the situation leaned slightly forward. "Interesting timing," he said quietly. The woman beside him nodded. She had noticed it too. Malcolm remained completely relaxed. He returned his phone to the tray table and looked out the window. Bright white clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. To anyone who did not know better, he appeared completely detached from the growing tension around him. Yet every notification pointed back to him. Emily opened one of the newly available records. Her pulse quickened. Several sections that had been restricted earlier were now partially visible. Executive designation confirmed. Corporate liaison active. Special oversight required. She read the information twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Then a final notification appeared across the top of the screen. Executive review initiated by authorized stakeholder. Emily froze. Authorized stakeholder. The phrase immediately caught her attention. She looked toward Malcolm again. The calm passenger sitting quietly by the window no longer seemed ordinary. Rebecca noticed Emily's expression. "What did you just read?" Emily swallowed. "Something I have never seen before." The cabin remained quiet. Even passengers several rows away sensed the shift in atmosphere. Assumptions were beginning to collide with facts. Rebecca still appeared confident, but small cracks were beginning to show. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty entered her expression. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat comfortably in seat 2A as though he had all the time in the world. And as additional corporate notifications continued arriving across crew systems throughout the aircraft, one thing became impossible to ignore. Whatever authority Malcolm Carter actually possessed, it was far greater than anyone on that flight had imagined. Emily Turner could barely take her eyes off the crew tablet. Each new notification seemed to confirm what she had already begun to suspect. The passenger profile connected to Malcolm Carter was unlike any she had ever encountered. What had started as a simple service concern was rapidly becoming something much larger. The aircraft cruised smoothly above the clouds, while an entirely different kind of turbulence spread through the cabin. Rebecca Collins stood near the galley, trying to maintain control of the situation. Yet control was becoming harder to hold. Too many people had noticed the unusual activity. Too many questions remained unanswered. A new message appeared on Emily's screen. Corporate Operations Review active. She opened it immediately. Additional records became available. Her eyes widened as she read. Verification complete. Executive designation confirmed. Special authority status active. Emily read every line twice. Then a third time. The information did not change. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching all afternoon noticed her expression. Something tells me this story is about to get interesting, he said quietly. The woman beside him nodded. I think it already is. Rebecca stepped toward Emily. Let me see that. Emily hesitated. Company policy normally restricted access to certain records. Yet the system itself had already elevated the review. The information was no longer hidden. Rebecca took the tablet and scanned the screen. At first her expression remained unchanged. Then slowly the confidence began fading from her face. She looked again, then once more. The executive markers were impossible to ignore. This cannot be right, she said. Emily lowered her voice. I checked multiple times. Rebecca continued reading. Several lines near the bottom of the profile immediately drew her attention. Executive stakeholder. Corporate advisory authority. Operational review access. Her pulse quickened. Around them, passengers sensed the shift. Nobody knew exactly what the crew had discovered, but everyone could see that something significant had changed. Malcolm remained seated by the window, calm, patient, unmoved. The same composure that had frustrated Rebecca earlier now felt almost intimidating. Not because he was threatening, because he seemed completely unsurprised by everything that was happening. Another notification appeared on both crew devices simultaneously. Corporate headquarters requested acknowledgement of executive review procedures. Emily stared at the screen. The request had been transmitted directly from senior leadership channels. She had never seen that happen during a routine flight. Rebecca slowly lowered the tablet. Who exactly is he? She whispered. Emily looked toward seat 2A. I think that is the question everyone is asking. Several passengers openly watched now. The businessman folded his newspaper completely and placed it on the empty seat beside him. Even travelers who had spent most of the flight working were paying attention. The cabin had become an audience waiting for an answer. Emily opened one final record. This time the information left little room for doubt. The designation connected Malcolm not merely to the company. It connected him to decisions made at the highest levels of leadership. Emily felt her heart race. Everything suddenly made sense. The restricted access, the executive monitoring, the immediate response after the phone call. None of it was random. None of it was ordinary. Rebecca stared toward Malcolm. Earlier she had viewed him as an inconvenience. Now uncertainty dominated every thought. Meanwhile, Malcolm looked out the window as sunlight reflected across the endless cloud layer below. He seemed completely at peace. The truth was moving steadily through company systems, through crew devices, and through the cabin itself. Assumptions were collapsing one by one. And as another corporate message arrived requesting direct acknowledgement of Malcolm Carter's executive authority status, everyone aboard the aircraft sensed the same thing. The answer was finally approaching, and when it arrived, nothing about the flight would remain the same. The notification from corporate headquarters arrived across multiple crew devices at nearly the same moment. Emily Turner saw it first. Rebecca Collins saw it seconds later. Both stared at their screens in complete silence. Around them, the first-class cabin remained unusually quiet. Passengers sensed that an answer was finally coming. The aircraft continued its smooth journey above the clouds, but inside the cabin the atmosphere felt suspended between assumption and reality. Emily opened the message and read every line carefully. Her pulse quickened with each sentence. The information was direct, clear, impossible to misunderstand. She slowly raised her eyes toward Malcolm Carter. He remained seated by the window with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the flight. Nothing about him had changed, yet everything around him had. Rebecca looked down at her screen again. Then a third time. The words refused to change. Executive authority verified. Strategic oversight confirmed. Corporate governance designation active. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. A businessman seated nearby noticed the expressions on both flight attendants. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Neither woman answered immediately. Emily finally took a breath. "The review has been completed." Several passengers turned toward her. Rebecca remained frozen. The confidence that had guided her decisions earlier in the flight had disappeared. Emily looked back at the screen. The passenger in seat 2A has verified executive authority connected to the airline's governing ownership group. A stunned silence spread through the cabin. Even passengers who had not followed the situation closely now understood that something extraordinary had been revealed. Rebecca stared toward Malcolm. Earlier, she had treated him like a passenger seeking attention. Now she realized how little she actually knew about him. Malcolm slowly closed his tablet and placed it on the tray table. Then he stood. The movement immediately captured the attention of everyone nearby. No dramatic music. No raised voice. No display of power. Just a man standing calmly in the aisle. He looked around the cabin for a moment before speaking. "I never asked for special treatment." Nobody interrupted. "I never asked anyone to recognize my position." His voice remained calm and measured. Several passengers nodded. They had witnessed that firsthand. Malcolm glanced briefly toward Rebecca. There was no anger in his expression, no desire to embarrass her, only certainty. What interested me was something much simpler. The cabin remained silent. How people choose to treat someone when they believe there is nothing to gain from showing respect. The words landed heavily. Emily felt a chill run through her, because that was exactly what everyone had witnessed. Malcolm looked toward the front of the cabin. "I am not the person who needed service today." A few passengers exchanged confused looks. Then he continued, "I am one of the people responsible for deciding how service standards are measured." The realization swept through the cabin. Several passengers lowered their eyes. Others looked toward Rebecca. Malcolm had never been seeking approval. He had never been trying to prove who he was. The truth was much bigger than that. He had the authority to influence the very system everyone else worked within. Rebecca looked down at her hands. For the first time since boarding, she appeared genuinely shaken. Malcolm remained calm. The same man who had boarded quietly. The same man who had been ignored. The same man who never once demanded recognition. Yet now the truth stood fully revealed before everyone. And as the aircraft continued across the sky, every person in first class understood the same thing. The passenger who had been denied the most basic courtesy was the very person with the authority to make the final decision about what happened next. For several moments after Malcolm Carter finished speaking, the first-class cabin remained completely silent. The aircraft continued its steady path above the clouds, but inside, everything felt different. Passengers who had spent the flight making assumptions now sat quietly with the truth in front of them. Rebecca Collins stood near the galley, unable to hide the realization settling across her face. The situation she believed she controlled had transformed into something far larger than a service dispute. Emily Turner lowered her tablet and looked toward Malcolm with a new sense of respect. What impressed her most was not his authority. It was the way he had carried himself before anyone knew he possessed it. Malcolm slowly returned to his seat and looked out the window. The sunlight reflecting across the cloud tops seemed peaceful compared to the tension that had filled the cabin only minutes earlier. A notification appeared on Rebecca's device. Then another. Corporate leadership had acknowledged the executive review. Documentation had been preserved. Follow-up procedures had been initiated. Everything would be handled through official channels. Several passengers noticed her expression change as she read the messages. Nobody needed to know the details to understand the outcome. The consequences had already begun. The businessman across the aisle finally spoke. "You could have stopped this much earlier." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Then why did you wait?" Malcolm looked around the cabin. Every passenger seemed interested in the answer. "Because titles influence behavior," he said. "I wanted to see what happened before mine entered the conversation." The cabin grew quiet again. The statement felt impossible to argue with. Everyone had witnessed exactly what he meant. The woman in the cream blazer nodded slowly. So this was never really about service. Malcolm shook his head. No, it was about respect. Emily felt those words stay with her. Respect. Such a simple idea. Yet the entire situation had grown from the absence of it. Rebecca finally stepped forward. Her confidence was gone, replaced by something more honest. Reflection. She looked toward Malcolm. "I made assumptions." Malcolm met her gaze. "Yes." The answer was neither cruel nor comforting. It was simply true. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Around the cabin, nobody celebrated her discomfort. The mood had shifted beyond blame. The lesson had become larger than one person. Malcolm rested his hands on the armrests and looked toward the passengers. The easiest people to respect are the ones whose importance is already visible. Several heads nodded. The real test is how you treat someone when you think they have nothing to offer you. No one spoke after that. They did not need to. The point had already landed. The remainder of the flight passed differently. Conversations became quieter. Observations became deeper. Passengers who had arrived focused on business deals and schedules found themselves thinking about something else entirely. Character, judgment, dignity. As the aircraft eventually began its descent, sunlight faded across the cabin windows. The journey was almost over. Yet for many aboard, the most important destination had nothing to do with the city waiting below. It was the realization that appearances reveal very little about a person's value. When the aircraft touched down and passengers prepared to leave, Malcolm gathered his tablet and stood. There was no grand exit, no demand for recognition, no display of status, just the same calm man who had boarded hours earlier. Before stepping into the aisle, he offered one final thought to those close enough to hear. Respect should never arrive after a title is discovered. Then he walked forward. The cabin remained silent as he passed, and long after he disappeared beyond the aircraft door, the lesson remained. Success may earn attention. Authority may command influence. But true character is revealed by how people treat others before they know who they are.